Okay, I'm Phil Winnie. I work at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, right near Vancouver in the southwest corner. I'm in the Faculty of Education, and this July 1st I'll celebrate my 45th anniversary there. Learning analytics was really interesting to me in 2012. There was a learning analytics conference in Vancouver, which I thought I would dip into. And I've always been interested in data, in analyzing data, and trying to find ways to use that data to help learners become better at what they do, the self-regulated learning interests I have. So I tried to put together the approaches that the learning analysts were describing at that conference. I found it harder, which made it interesting to me, and so that's how I'm involved in learning analytics. Mostly we're using it in research, because the kinds of tools I think we need to have to use it in my teaching are being developed around the world, including in my lab. The research that we're carrying out is using software called N-Study, and essentially it tries to record everything that learners do in the interface in ways that help me understand what information are they selecting to process cognitively, and how are they processing that information cognitively. My favorite example is highlighting. When a learner chooses some particular phrase or clause or sentence or more to highlight, they've found some quality of that information that matters to them. They think important, that they should restudy it. They think it's vague, and so they need to clarify it. They might want to use it as a quote in a paper they're writing. That's metadata. Data about the data, the information that's in that actual text. And so that tells me that students are engaged in a particular way. I like to track those kinds of things and generate interpretations of them. That's what I call trace data. Problems that need solving in learning analytics are legion. For me, there are a couple that I think I'd put on the forefront. One of them is, how can we develop software that lets me as an observer try to understand validly what the learner's thinking is about and also about their motivation. Another really challenging problem is, because when learners are studying material, what they do is driven by the material they're studying. So somehow we need to find a way to characterize what the instructional design is and think about helping learners articulate what they're trying to do to process that information to the instructional design. So for example, lots of introductory materials have a set of objectives at the beginning. Those objectives would cue a learner to look for certain information later. So then I would expect to see learners highlighting certain information. But if the designer thought to leave those objectives to be interspersed or to not present them at all, a learner would behave differently. So we need to find ways to get those lined up so that when I make interpretations about what learners are doing, it's attached to the instructional design. Well, first for students, to the benefits that they receive from learning analytics, I like to think about self-regulating learning as being a form of impoverished learning science. What I mean by that is that every learner has some kind of easygoing theory about how they learn, but they don't have very complete data about how they learn. They have, as all humans do, fallible memories about what they've been doing. They lack often some empirical evidence about what really works for them. So I think that what we need to solve for them as a problem is to help them identify, when do they do what? Is what they're doing sufficiently effective for what they want? And is what they're doing and what they want aligned closely enough to the instructor's goals so that they can fare well in school? So for them, we need to find ways in which we can characterize the circumstances, the characteristics of the material they're presented with and how they work with it. As I was describing before, for instance, this kind of outline they'd fill out about controversial information. And help them come to better recognize, well, should they fill out those forms? Do they work for them? Does it help? That information, as well as other information, should go to teachers. So some of the problems they face are understanding, do the students recognize controversial information? Do I need to be more direct in saying, this is a debatable point, and then lay out what those elements of the debates are? And in interaction between what the teacher is doing to design the materials and the way students are working with it, can we help students form, or rather teachers form, better instructional designs so that the information they'd like to have about what learners are doing is set up in a way so that learners can document through working with the software or other paper-based ways what they're doing, helping teachers think about their instructional designs like I would in setting up an experiment about the independent variables and the control variables. Challenges that associate with learning analytics. Again, these are legion. One really interesting one is this issue I was just talking about before of how you align features of instructional design and instrumentation, software or other ways of getting information, so that you can improve the instruction at the same time as you're trying to help learners become more self-regulated. A huge challenge that we're facing with software systems these days is circles around questions about privacy and anonymity and who owns data. On the one hand, I would hope that everybody would be interested to adopt a position of social responsibility, thinking, yes, if I contribute my data, I can help everybody move towards a nicer place in learning and teaching. But of course, lots of people are worried that misuses of that information could be resulting from sharing data with people that they don't want it shared with, used in ways that the learners or the teachers might not be interested to see happen. So I pay a lot of attention to these issues, but I'm still optimistic that everybody will adopt these social responsible positions and somehow we'll figure out absolutely unbreakable ways to keep data private in the ways that it should. A third really interesting challenge, I think, or problem that learning analytics is facing is finding ways to talk to learners and instructors in ways that give them guidance. A favorite example of mine, which is a personal experience, I remember in elementary school being told that I should write summaries of the material I was studying. And I asked the question, how do I do that? And the teacher essentially said, well, you'll know it when you see it. That's not good enough. So, for instance, 2 steps toward summarizing would be these. When you're looking at material to summarize, strike out the examples. Those details typically don't go in summaries. And if the material you're summarizing has a number of elements that could be put into a category or group, don't mention the elements themselves, mention the name of the group. Move up the hierarchy of knowledge, so to speak. Those are some straightforward rules that you could use to expose what it means to summarize so that people, first of all, could understand what they're supposed to do and check whether they're doing that. Well, sadly, we don't have enough of that step-by-step approach for lots of things we describe about learning skills, and finding ways to translate these great ideas into step-by-step procedures that people can check is another challenge that I think is important, which we have to solve if the learning analytics are going to be communicative to the students and to their teachers. There are a couple of things that I think that both students and teachers across all levels of education could begin to think about. One is, how can you keep records of what you do and how what you do correlates with what you learn? We did a little study some time ago in our lab where we were able to document under some very laboratory-like conditions, so this is not particularly generalizable, that you have about twice as much chance to remember something you highlight as something you don't. So imagine a student who is able, given materials they might not have to give over back to the school, to actually mark up their materials. How does the student test this? They'd need to have a record of all the things they highlighted, and they'd need to be able to draw a map between the topics of each of those things and some kind of measure of achievement. That's really difficult. So, could we think of a way in which, for instance, we could get lists of those things that are highlighted and correlate them, highlight or a cluster of highlights to, say, test items? Then the student would be able to say, highlighting is working even better for me than this research finding, or this isn't working very well, I need to find out a little more clearly what I might do differently. For teachers, those records are also really important. So let's take the context of teachers asking questions in class. When a teacher poses a question to the whole group, the teacher is under some pressure to move through the material. So what do teachers do? Well, often they have a very good sense that some students will struggle in answering that question and not give a very clear answer or not be able to answer it, and other students will pretty quickly give just the right answer. So who does the teacher call on because they have this time pressure? The student who gives the right answer. In that case, the teacher has no clue whether a student she thought might not be able to answer the question actually could. So, instead of doing it that way, could a teacher in a classroom create the opportunity to get records by saying, today we're going to do something a little differently. Every question I ask, I want you to take just maybe 35 or 40 seconds to jot down the main points you would like to include in your answer. And I'd like you to do this in a table where one column is, I thought of it, and the other column is, I heard it. Now when the teacher asks a question, all the students are rapidly scribbling whatever they can in the column, I thought it. And for those students who put some things there that are actually not quite right or on target, or wrong, or nothing, then in the I heard it column, they copy the information. The benefit here is now the teacher can collect that and see, are her questions being understood by the class, who's generating answers, who's hearing answers. And the second column, I heard it, has the benefit of the student who wasn't able to answer the question now working with the information that is the answer. It's laborious to collect all of those papers, so we'd like to develop a software system that would do that, which would of course require every student to have their own computer to work with or some other tablet kind of device. But there's an illustration about a way in which we could take an approach to learning analytics where the teacher would be able to investigate more about what effects questions are having, and students get to work with the information even if they weren't able to answer the question in the first place, which is an analytic for them to think about, why wasn't I prepared to answer that question? How would I change what I do so tomorrow I can? The current state of analytics today is exciting. It's exciting because there's so much opportunity. The opportunities to imagine ways in which we can involve learners more in trying to understand what learning really is and to individualize it for them. And similarly for teachers, to collect information that helps teachers better understand the ways that they're teaching, the materials they're providing, the activities they structure for students. How are those things working? And I might be a bit optimistic, but I think people, both in the roles of instructors and in the roles of learners, really want to do a good job. If we can just give them the tools to help them do a better job, that's really motivating. So I might be a little on the edge of this, but I think that learning analytics is a bit of the bridge to move from the state we currently have to one that I think is going to be more, help people be more enthusiastic about learning. Well, there are a couple of things about the next steps for learning analytics. One of them is to figure out how we can generate better data gathering instruments. So I mentioned this paper and pencil activity for the I thought of it, I heard it kind of thing. Can we just translate that into a simple note-taking form of software people could use? Or could we find some other way to make that an efficient process in classrooms? The second area that I think is a big next step, which is off on the horizon for us, is to figure out ways in which we can understand that information. The words that the students are going to write on those pieces of paper or enter in their keyboards, or if we could find ways to suppress the noise in the classroom, dictate into their ear pods. Can we develop technologies that understand what's being written? Currently we could, for instance, compare, is this key concept mentioned? For instance, in a physics class, does the student have angular momentum on the paper? We can look to see whether those letters appear in that order. But we also want to know whether the student understands that, and that means more about understanding the natural language. So natural language processing, I think, is a huge and inviting horizon on the future for learning analytics. And the third area is one I mentioned earlier about trying to dissect what learning skills really are and what learning strategies are when you compile and put into sequence all of those tactics. And finding ways to feed information, learning analytics, back to the learners in a form they understand so they can carry out their own personal and progressive programs of research to become better at learning what they want to learn. How we feed that information back, what schedule we use, is it just when they want it, is it on certain time schedules, like after every studying episode or each week. How we communicate that in the format, is it words, is it tables, is it diagrams, is it graphs? And how learners can keep a kind of diary or log about that, just like a bench scientist would. That notion about the learning log and the ways learners could put information in it and make sense of it, I think, is something that we also could look forward to in the future.